And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A happy Tuesday evening, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And with me, of course, is Daniel Rogers. Daniel, great to have you back again, as usual. Hope everything's going well with you down there in uh,
Alabama.
yeah, I just don't want to mention that name because the football game's
Ugh.
coming up, and
Well,
it's already been bad once, and so it's going to get even worse the second time around. So I really didn't want to utter the words, although my Hogs did come through this last weekend. I must
yeah.
say, in an absolutely thriller nail biter. They got lucky. Uh, and so, really, really cool going to a bowl game for the first time in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. So,
Well,
uh,
congratulations. There you go.
yeah. First, Arkansas has been lower than they ever have been. I mean, literally lower than they ever have been. And it's just been awful. But nonetheless, they're on their way back. One of these days, uh, one of these days, when Nick Saban retires, Arkansas will actually beat Alabama,
Yeah, that's right.
and somebody else will too, other than A&M getting lucky occasionally.
Oof.
So have to be optimistic about things like that. So anyway, so what's going on in your world?
Oh well, we've got a free vision screening planned for the community here on Friday, and then the following Saturday.
Very good.
So we're hoping to get a big turnout from that, and then from there we'll invite a whole bunch of people to our Friendsgiving luncheon on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. So that's super exciting.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
here's something else that happened. They asked me if I would teach a Tuesday morning Bible study for Golden Agers, and I told you about that.
Yeah.
And the first few classes we had maybe 6 to 8 there, and then this last Tuesday we had 16 in
Wow.
attendance.
Holy
And so,
cow.
yeah, we doubled the numbers, more than
Yeah.
doubled, really. And so we're going through the book of Galatians. And just for those listening, if you'd like to download the handouts from that or the commentary that I'm working on for it, as I'm writing it, you can go to my website, labornotinvain.com/Galatians. And then all that's there. So,
Awesome. That's
yeah.
very, very good.
How about you? What's going on with you?
Well, I tell you what, as you know, I'm kind of technologically challenged, and I keep getting these invitations to do Zoom meetings, and I've had some. I've actually had several of them, and let's see, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, yeah, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, uh, a little bit of a backstory. I had been contacted by a guy, pardon me, from India, just insistent that I hold a Zoom meeting with them. And I hadn't been able to find out anything with him. So I began asking him about himself and about his ministry since he was a minister. And he finally revealed to me that William had done some Zoom meetings with them. So that was a really good sign. And I thought, well, if William has done some Zoom meetings with them, then he feels good about doing that. So if William feels good about it, then I feel good about it. And so I finally agreed. Well, I did not know how to set up a Zoom meeting. So on the very first day in which we were supposed to get together, it took us almost 30 minutes. And I will say it wasn't all my fault. He had some difficulties on his end, but we had a very good introduction to one another. And so we finally set it up for uh, day after. No, it's tomorrow now. For tomorrow, I will be having a Zoom meeting with a group from India. And he told me that they will have anywhere from 35 to 50 people who will join in the Zoom meeting.
Wow.
And not only that, in the interim, I was contacted by another minister from India. And I think he also knows William. And I think William has actually held several Zoom meetings with them. And this individual wanted a copy of my Acts and the Restoration of Israel MP3 series that I did years ago. It's 52 lessons. And for those of you who are interested, it is available on my websites. And he said, but we have a large number of people here who want to hear that material. So I was wondering if you could send me the MP3 disc. And I got to thinking, well, but then he asked if I could give it download. So we've provided that download for him now. And he came back so very, very appreciative and said that you need to know that in my village, there are 1,500, that's 1,500 people that watch your morning musings every single day. You know, they all gather around as much as possible with just a very, very few computers, but 1,500 people from one village watch my morning musings there in India. And I was
Wow.
like, holy cow. You know, that's pretty incredible. That's pretty awesome. So, yeah, that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in the YouTube analytics, you know?
I told my wife that very thing. I said, if you look at my YouTube viewership, it has been slowly growing. And in a week's period of time, it only shows that, I mean, obviously they're not going viral. Every once in a while, I get one that will, have a couple of thousand. But nonetheless, as a general rule, the regular viewership every week is fluctuating now somewhere between six to 900 views in about a week. Well, hey, that's not too bad. That's the largest congregation I have ever preached to, and I've got 5,700 subscribers, so that's the largest congregation I have ever preached to. But when you understand, and I should point out, I have had other people tell me that every single morning they also have a group of people in their home. This happens in Norway, for instance. Uh, of a group of people gets together and they watch my videos every single morning. It happens in South Africa that I know of, and now in India. Now nobody else compares with 1,500, mind you, but but the point of it is that insofar as the analytics are concerned, there's only one computer that's logged on to watch the video.
Right.
When in reality there may be 10 or 15, 20 people in a room that are watching and listening to the program. So that is really really exciting stuff.
That's impressive. Yes, for sure.
So other than that, I'm really starting to make some good progress on this book that I'm currently working on. I'm currently working on a book entitled "The Last Day, the Last Hour, the Last Trumpet, Resurrection." One of the chief arguments, if you wish to call it that I hear a lot from the opponents of covenant eschatology is, well, okay, you have all of these statements of imminence of the coming of the Lord judgment, et cetera, but when Jesus spoke about the resurrection on the last day, that's obviously the last day of time. Now, that's such a presuppositional argument that, honestly, from a logical perspective, it has no merit at all. To assume, but because Jesus spoke of the last day, it has to refer to the last day of time is a non sequitur. There's no way to justify that. But nonetheless, that's their argument. So I set out a good little while ago. It's been almost 2 years ago now. I set out to explore the whole concept of the last day, the last hour, and the last trumpet resurrection. And it has segued into a discussion of the feast days and the significance of the very last of Israel's feast day, technically the next to the last feast day, which is the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of the Ingathering. Because everywhere you turn in the Old Testament as well as the New, you find all of these eschatological prophecies of the last days ingathering, which are passages, which are prophecies of the last days resurrection. Isaiah 26 and 27 is a classic example of that. And Isaiah 27:13 says, in that day, which is the day of Israel's salvation at the coming of the Lord, which is in fact, guess what? The time of the resurrection, Isaiah 26:19 and following. You follow the references to in that day, and you see it's all interconnected. It's inseparably connected. So in Isaiah 27 and 13, it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet, shall be sounded, and those who are perishing in Egypt and Pathros, etc., shall be gathered together to serve the Lord on his holy hill Zion. That's a paraphrase. But nonetheless, that's the whole point. And the ancient rabbis acknowledged that this sounding the great trumpet was the last day's resurrection. Well, what's interesting, of course, is in Matthew 24, verse 31, according to G.K. Beale, according to virtually all of the critical scholars who specialize, i.e., Marshall is one of them, uh, who specialize in pointing out the New Testament use of the Old Testament, and they all admit Matthew 24:31 is a direct echo. It's actually a citation, not just an echo. It's a direct citation of Isaiah 27:13. And of course, here's what's so ironic about that. In the amillennial and in the postmillennial world, it's almost universally admitted, certainly in the fellowship that I was raised and in which you were raised as well, it's admitted that Matthew 24:29 to 31 was a reference to the coming of the Lord in the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Yes.
So, okay, you have Jesus speaking about his coming in the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, Matthew 24:30 and 31. But in in Matthew 24:31, Jesus is quoting from Isaiah 27:13, which is a prediction of the resurrection at the last day. Therefore, by admitting that Matthew 24:30 and 31 is a prediction of the coming of the Lord and the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, our brethren in the amillennial world, postmillennial world, are admitting that Jesus was predicting that the resurrection was to be at the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. Hello? That just happens to be a train, as I have used that argument over and over and over and over again in private conversations and private correspondence. It's like a 4,000 car train that just runs over everyone, and they don't know how to answer it. They don't know
Mm.
what to do about it. But there it is.
And that's
So,
why it's so important to know the Old Testament. And if we're not familiar with that, then we make silly comments, that look good on the surface, but then when you trace them to the logical end, they don't fit within our eschatological paradigms,
yeah.
and that's because of our ignorance of the Old Testament. But
Well, and let's face it. I freely confess this, not with pride, but I was totally ignorant of the Old Testament. And yet, I will tell you, as I shared here on the program some weeks ago, as I was reading Acts chapter 8, and I realized that Philip began in Isaiah 53, and he preached Jesus from Isaiah 53 onward, undoubtedly also referencing Zephaniah, but nonetheless, and as a result of Philip's preaching from the Tanakh, the Old Testament that I had always been taught and had always taught was no longer valid, no longer binding, no longer, quote, effective. Um, Philip could preach Jesus to the eunuch and convert the eunuch to Jesus Christ. And I knew that I had no clue how to do that. I determined to be able to do that. I'm closer to that today than I've ever been. But this is a classic example, the situation I gave there in Matthew 24:30 and 31. I had no clue whatsoever. No clue whatsoever for the greater part of my life until probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. That recently, Daniel, I had been studying Isaiah in what they call the little apocalypse, which is so rich. Isaiah 24 through 27. Some expand it into Isaiah 29. Be that as it may, I just determined that I was going to understand those chapters better because as I read the critical commentaries, and they say, well, here in the book of Matthew, here in Mark, here in Luke, Jesus cites the little apocalypse. And the very first time I read that, I'm going, the what? The little apocalypse? What is that? So when I discovered what it was, I could see where Jesus obviously was quoting from those chapters. And the power of his quotations was like, whoa, wow, that's good stuff. So now I've got to understand that. So I began studying the little apocalypse closer. And I want to tell you, over and over and over again in Isaiah 24, I certainly expand it into chapter 28. I have no problem whatsoever including chapter 29 because over and over and over in those chapters, the resurrection, the time of Israel's salvation, is inextricably bound up with the, let's see, how to elucidate this. Isaiah 24 through 29 ties the time of the judgment on Jerusalem and Israel with, number one, the time of the salvation of Israel. Number two, the destruction of, quote, heaven and earth, Isaiah 24, 19 and following. Number three, to the time of the end of the millennium, Isaiah 24, 19 and to 21. And again, the judgment of the city and the temple is tied to the Messianic wedding banquet, Isaiah 25, verse 6. The time of the resurrection, Isaiah 25, verse 8. Again, the time of Israel's salvation, Isaiah 26, verse 9 and 10. And again, the time of the resurrection, Isaiah 26, verse 10, all the way through the end of the chapter. Isaiah 26, 19 to 21, the time of the vindication of the martyrs. Isaiah 27, 1 and 2, the time of the destruction of Leviathan, which always occurs at the end of the millennium. This is likewise, once again, the time of Israel's salvation. It is tied with the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, Isaiah 27, 9 and following, which Paul quotes verbatim in Romans 11, 26 and 27, as he anticipates, quote, all Israel shall be saved, unquote, at the coming of the Lord out of Zion. And once again, it would be that time of salvation, the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, would be when the fortified city would be left desolate, the altar of the temple would be turned to chalk stone, the people whom the Lord had created would no longer find mercy because they were a people of no understanding, a direct citation of Deuteronomy chapter 28. I'm sorry, 32, verse 28. And so the more that I saw and began to understand the little apocalypse, and to cap all that off, Isaiah 27:13, in that day, which once again is the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, in that day, the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, when the fortified city would be left desolate, the altar would be turned to chalk stone, and the people whom the Lord had created would no longer obtain mercy. In that day, those who had escaped, those who had survived, this is the righteous remnant, of course, the great trumpet would sound to gather those who were about to perish from the four winds and to gather them to Jerusalem to worship. So, I mean, the power and the value of understanding the New Testament, along with, or seen through the prism of, or if you want to reverse that and say the Old Testament, seen through the prism of the New Testament, cannot be overestimated. And that is especially true when we come to our subject, Daniel, of the Messianic Temple. we've been trying to share with our audience over the last several weeks, months even, about the power of John chapter 4, in which Jesus told the Samaritan woman that the time was coming. Indeed, the time had arrived, in which neither in Gerizim or in Jerusalem would men be required to worship. Men could worship God, anybody, anyone, not just the Jews, although salvation would be spring from the Jews. Jesus iterated that. He confirmed that salvation is of the Jews. Nonetheless, that salvation would flow from the Jews to all nations. This is uh, this is how the New Testament explains the Old Testament. Some of those prophecies in the Old Testament that must have been, as we have shared, shocking. They were revolutionary. They were dramatic. And let me say this, they were very often ignored by even the greatest of the rabbinic scholars, who would literally gloss right over them. And yet, here is Jesus giving us insight in the Gospel of John, direct insight. Well, what did it mean when Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 11 said that men could worship the Lord in any place and at any time? What did it mean when Malachi 1:11 said the same thing? What did it mean in Isaiah chapter 60 when even the Midianites, the inveterate enemies of Israel, all the way down through her history, the Ishmaelites slash Midianites, would be able to come and to serve as priests to offer up acceptable sacrifices on the altar of God? Well, Jesus explains that. Incense can be offered unto the Lord from the rising of the sun to the going down. In every place, worship will be offered to him, says the Lord. Well, if it's in any place, that means it's by anyone. I mean, you can't universalize the location without universalizing the worshipers. And so this is what we mean by emphasizing the importance of seeing how the New Testament applies the Old. But that means that we have to know the Old. And sometimes, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Sometimes the Old gives us, shall we call it a nail of additional information that the New does not explicitly give us, but by the New citing the Old, then you know that that nail that is found in the Old Testament text is included in the New Testament prophecy. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, just before coming on air, Daniel and I were talking about understanding the New Testament through the Old through the New, and what have you. And we were talking about a book written by Stephanos Mahalios. He is a Wheaton professor, and he wrote a book, The Danielic Eschatological Hour in the Johannine Literature. That's somewhat close to the name of the book. It is an extremely insightful book. He points out, Mahalios points out, that in John chapter 5, 28 and 29, Jesus speaks about the resurrection of both the just and the unjust. He speaks of the resurrection to eternal life at the last hour. And Mahalios points out the only place in all of the Old Testament, the only place, ladies and gentlemen, in which those three motifs, okay, last hour, just and unjust, eternal life, everlasting life. The only place in all the Old Testament where those three motifs are explicitly, specifically mentioned is Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Well, what should that tell us? I mean, there can be no doubt about what it tells us. It tells us that Jesus was drawing on Daniel chapter 12. Well, you see, Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 includes some information that Jesus did not quote from. But since he's using Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, then guess what? He is drawing on the entire prophetic context of Daniel chapter 12. And Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 tells us that that resurrection that was being predicted, that resurrection of the last hour, the last time, the last day, that resurrection to everlasting life, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, would be when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. That that becomes definitive, ladies and gentlemen, for understanding the temporal framework for the fulfillment of John 5, 28, 29. Look, it challenges our traditional beliefs about the nature of the resurrection. But when you have such explicit use of the Old Testament by Jesus, and when you find that those explicit statements from the Old Testament giving us the time frame for the fulfillment of that very prophecy, then proper exegesis and proper hermeneutic and proper logic says, okay, I've got to accept Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 as normative for understanding John chapter 5, 28 and 29.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in Daniel 12, as you're pointing out, he specifically mentions there the end of the days, and some versions translate that the end of the age, to try to capture more of the idea of what Daniel's saying. And I believe, as we were talking about before the broadcast started, the word day in, for example, John 7 and John 11 and John 6, where the expression eschatos,
Uh,
hemeron,
um,
there we go,
yeah,
hemeron, yeah, it's a omega there at the end.
yeah,
How that expression is used there, and it's not eschatos, but it's soon is used in Daniel 12:13 and the Septuagint to talk about the end of the age or the end of the days. And so when you have all those parallels, it really is unmistakable. And that was one of the things that made me a full preterist is I was preaching through Daniel 12 just like you did. And
yeah,
I was preaching through the entire book of Daniel, actually, and I was using Rex Turner Sr.'s little blue commentary.
yeah,
You probably
yeah.
uh yeah. And as I went through all the chapters, I thought, okay, I can track and follow all this. And I got to chapter 9, and it was okay. I had to use a little bit of Foy Wallace's help from God's prophetic word, but it worked out.
Yeah.
Then when I got to Daniel 12, no, there are far too many parallels with Matthew 24. This is connected to John 5. I just can't preach this the way that Rex Turner has it. And so I
Yeah.
had to do a comparative study and reach the conclusion that whatever Daniel 12 is talking about, it's not talking about the resurrection of bodies at the end of time. It just does not fit.
No, it certainly doesn't. And you mentioned, studying through Daniel chapter 12. One of the eye opening things to me was, as you point out, Daniel's use in the Septuagint, of course, of Suntalia. Uh, earlier in the chapter, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, he mentions Suntelos. I believe that's correct. And when you come to Matthew, and you go to Matthew chapter 13, 39, and 40, and you find Jesus predicting the gathering, the harvest, which of course is the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. But in Matthew chapter 13, 39, and 40, Jesus says, so shall it be at the end of the age. Suntelia to aeonion. That's
Mm.
taken directly from Daniel chapter 12.
It is, and what's the word there? Time of the end is kairos. So it's the
Yes,
appointed time of the end, which
yes.
is what Peter points out in First Peter 4. I mean, and his entire book is talking about you have this incorruptible seed, and as you know, he cites from Hosea chapter 1 and First Peter 2. And the only thing that he doesn't mention, he talks about those of you who have not received mercy, you have received mercy. Those of you who are told, you are no longer my children, you are now the children of God. The only thing that he doesn't bring up is Jireh, or not Jireh, but Jezreel, right, from Hosea 1.
Right.
And that's because that's all that was left was for the harvest to take place.
Yeah, and
And yeah, and calling that the appointed time for judgment has come in First Peter 4 is all but saying that the time for resurrection has come.
and I found this particularly effective. I had two formal YouTube debates with Dr. Michael Brown. He's a very, very highly respected apologist. Has debated many Jews, many atheists, et cetera, et cetera. And he's actually done a fair amount of good, but unfortunately, he's a premillennialist. And when we came to discuss Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, I completely blew him away, to be honest about it. He started out in his presentation, contrary to Brother Preston, I believe that Israel in Romans 11, 25 to 27 is not the church. When Paul says all Israel shall be saved, he's not talking about the church. He's talking about Israel. And I'm sitting there going, he's never read a word I said that I've written. I don't think he understands what I'm saying or what I have said. So I came back and I said, well, I don't understand why Dr. Brown said what he did. I happen to, and by the way, we were on video. I said, I concur 100% that Israel in Romans 11, 25 to 27 is inclusive of national Israel. But Paul's talking about the righteous remnant of national Israel, but there's still Israel. It's not the church divorced from Israel. You should have seen the look on his face, Daniel. He was shocked. I mean, literally shocked. Well, to shorten this story up, I pointed out that Peter's hermeneutic and Paul's hermeneutic was the Old Testament writers did not always understand exactly specifically what it was they were predicting or when it would be fulfilled. That's emphatically what Peter teaches. And by the way, folks, this has directly to do with the Messianic Temple. When my millennial friends say, hey, listen, the Bible says what it means what it says. It says a temple is going to be built. That means a temple is going to be built. Well, guess what? Peter said, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, concerning this salvation, the salvation that the saints in 1 Peter were in the process of receiving even at that time. Concerning this salvation, the prophets have inquired and searched diligently to understand the time and the manner of the things of which they spoke, to whom it was revealed that not to themselves did they minister those things, but to us who spoke those things by the Holy Spirit sent down from God. Now, Peter said the Old Testament prophets knew that what they sought to understand both the time and the manner of the things that they foretold. Then Peter launches off into a discussion, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, you therefore, writing to the saints, as living stones are being built up a spiritual house to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable unto God through Jesus Christ. Well, guess what? He is directly echoing Hosea and the promise that in the last days, pardon me, in Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and following, Israel will be without ephod, they will be without altar, they will be without priesthood until the last days, and they shall serve David their king. Well, let me see here. 1 Peter chapter 2, the rejected stone has become the chief cornerstone of what? Of the temple, the altar, the new priesthood, etc., etc. And I have to tell you, when I pointed out, number one, that Peter said the Old Testament writers did not fully understand either the time or the nature of the things which they spoke, Dr. Brown flinched. And in the comments and in private comments to me many times, I had people contact me privately and say, I have been a follower of Michael Brown for years now. I have never, ever seen him so flummoxed in a debate. You shook him to his foundation. And that was real obvious. I mean, he surrendered a couple of things, just overtly surrendered a couple of my points during the debate, and I thanked him for it, uh, telling him basically he surrendered the debate, which of course he wouldn't admit to. But the point of it is, when we're looking at the subject of the Messianic temple, what are we doing? We cannot take the literalistic approach that says, and that's why we spend so much time on the New Testament passages that are interpreting the Old. I mean, after all, in First Peter, when he says that those living individuals were living stones to build up a spiritual temple, that pretty and he says Christ is the chief cornerstone of that temple. And he quotes Old Testament passages of Isaiah chapter 8, Psalms 118, Daniel 2:44. He quotes virtually every Old Testament prophecy of the Messianic temple chief cornerstone, including Isaiah 28:16 and following, by the way, and he applies it to Jesus Christ as the living chief cornerstone. Well, if those Old Testament prophecies are, as my dispensational friends admit, if those are Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Messianic temple, and here you have Peter in First Peter applying those prophecies, number one, to Jesus Christ, the chief living cornerstone, and the living saints of the first century as building stones of this spiritual house, then guess what? The Bible doesn't say what it means and mean what it says in some woodenly literalistic manner that says, oh, temple means temple. Well, temple means dwelling place. Okay, it says what it means, then it means what it says. But according to First Peter, that temple of God foretold by the Old Testament prophets is a spiritual house built upon the living cornerstone of Jesus Christ. Now, that's how John chapter 4 must be understood. Just like Jesus said to the woman, "Woman, give me a drink." Her response, "How is it that you, being a Jew, asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink of water? Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And Jesus said, "Well, if you knew who it was talking to you, you would ask, and I'd give you living waters, and you'd never thirst again." Well, Lord, give me this. Let's have it. Give me a drink. Give me some of this water. Our fathers, they drew from this well, and we thirst. We're constantly coming out here. So if you got water that I don't have to come out here all the time and draw, then you give it to me. And as is so often the case in the book of John, Jesus was talking on a spiritual level, which means when he's talking about the temple, he's talking about spiritual realities. But his audience, in this case, the Samaritan woman, was thinking and talking on a woodenly literalistic perspective. Hey, give me water so that I don't ever have to go to all the trouble. Listen, the woman coming out there to the well was fulfilling her understood obligations of the time. It was the woman's responsibility in that society to draw the water. That was that was something basically that men didn't do unless it was out of absolute necessity. That's the woman's job. And so it was tough work for a woman to draw water, carry buckets such as they were, maybe two of them suspended on a pole on that the woman would put across the top of her shoulders. This is tough work. So you can understand the woman's physical attraction to the idea of never having to come out there to the well anymore. And yet Jesus was speaking transcendently, and she just didn't get it. And Daniel, I find increasingly that's the same problem that we have in trying to convince a lot of people of covenant eschatology.
Hmm. That's right, and that's why the book of John is so powerful for talking about covenant eschatology, because it's Jesus time and time again encountering these people who take a woodenly literal view of Scripture and just turns it up on its head and shows to them a more excellent way. And when I think about that woman at the well, a point that I don't know if we actually brought this up or not, is she came out there alone. And
Yeah.
women, if I believe correctly, they traveled in groups to
Yes.
go out there because of robbers or some kind of
Yes.
trouble. And
Yes.
so that just goes ahead and shows even further how compassionate Jesus was in reaching out, and how odd it was, really, reaching out to this woman who's most likely castigated for her sexual promiscuity, you know. And so for him to go out of his way to talk to her really shows that the gospel truly is for everyone and not just for some little small group of people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to carry that on that thought, not only were women normally supposed to travel together for their own safety and security and just peace of mind, can you imagine what she must have felt and thought as she approaches the well and here comes this Jewish man?
Oh yeah, yeah.
She, she had to be scared. She had to be frightened at the possibility of what might happen.
That's right, and part of her also was thinking, well, at least he won't talk to me, you know, because
Yeah,
he
yeah,
when she saw the tassels on his
yeah,
outfit, she might have thought, well, he won't talk to me at least. But then when he opened up his mouth, it was just such a culture shock because here this woman is all alone, and now she finds herself talking to the Messiah, and she asks that question she was dying to ask, and Jesus shows her that she was thinking about it all wrong from the very beginning, and the whole debate was really founded on a false presupposition about God, that God needed a house to dwell in.
that's
Uh,
right.
but but
And that gets back to our contrast between the dispensational world and the biblical doctrine of the Messianic Temple. Why anyone, and I say with all due respect, I've had lots and lots of friends who are dispensationalists, but why in the world anyone would espouse and embrace a doctrine that says the spiritual temple of God will be raptured off of the world, off of the earth, and in its place, a literal physical temple involved in a physical cultus of animal sacrifices restored, being offered by genealogically confirmed priest once again in a literal physical temple. Why that is attractive on any level, I do not know. It means that God will replace. I wrote a book some years ago, a few years ago. um, One Root, One Kingdom, All Nations. And it is a response to the charge of replacement theology. It's one of the larger books that I've written. But it just points out the typological nature of everything about Old Covenant Israel and the fact that Israel and her entire cultus was never, ever, ever intended to be permanent. Israel, as God's chosen people, was never intended to be God's permanent, exclusive people. I'm reminded of Genesis 28:15 and following, in which Jacob wrestled with the angel and managed to prevail to a certain extent. The angel finally struck him on the thigh, and I'm sure everyone's fairly familiar with the story. But Yahweh gave Jacob the assurance, and because he named the place Bethel, house of God. So Yahweh gave him this assurance, and I find this is one of the most ignored Old Testament prophecies that you will ever read. Yeah, pardon me. We have people saying, "Oh well, now look, Israel remains God's chosen people." They will always be God's covenant people. It is blasphemy. It's heresy to suggest that God would ever replace Israel. Well, um, in Genesis chapter 28, I'll just start back with verse 12. He, that is Jacob, dreamed a ladder was set up on the earth, and the top reached to heaven. Uh, my goodness, I've got a stain on my page that I can't hardly read that. The angels of God were ascending and descending on it. I ought to be able to quote it, but anyway. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you dwell I will give to you and to your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south, and in you and all your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. Now watch this little promise. It's not a little promise. It's a massive promise with incredible implications for those who say Israel will always remain God's chosen people. I will not leave you, now that's he and his descendants, until I have done what I have spoken to you. Wow. Here God is saying, when I have fulfilled my purposes in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their lineage, when I fulfill my promise to bless all families of the earth. You see, because this is not just about the land promises. Land promises are included, but it goes far beyond that. It goes to blessing all nations of the earth, which takes us back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. In you, Abraham, and in your seed, that's singular, shall all nations of the earth be blessed. So here is Yahweh saying, I'm going to be with you. That means you and your seed. And I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've done what I've spoken to you. Here's a promise that at the time of the blessing of all nations of the earth in the singular seed of Messiah, Israel would no longer be the chosen seed, chosen people of God. Now, any man, every man can partake of the blessings.
And what he says immediately after that just goes perfectly into our discussion in John 4, because he says, surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know. And what Jesus is telling the Samaritan woman is, not only is the Lord in this place, he's in every place.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Gets back to that idea. There are hints, there are clues, there are comments to be found throughout the Old Testament that are so radical in their nature when read through the prism of the New Testament, when applied through the prism of the New Testament, when understood of saying, oh, wait a minute. Jacob said, I didn't realize God was here. I thought God was up here, over there, somewhere else, but he's everywhere? Really? How revolutionary is that? So, yeah, all of this has directly to do with this concept of the Messianic Temple. And I hope that everyone can see why we are emphasizing all of these New Testament passages in, in which, unless we are very familiar with the cultus, unless we are familiar with the typology, unless we are familiar with the world of the Old Covenant people, with what the German scholars call the Leben, the actual real life situation, life on the ground, so to speak. We're going to gloss right over a lot of this, and we're not even going to come close to fathoming the depths and the beauty and the real significance of so many of these passages. Uh, any closing comments you want to make on John chapter 4 before we move on, Daniel?
No, I think maybe a good closing comment, though, would be in John 4, after his disciples return to set us up for the Feast of Tabernacles, he says, "Behold, the fields are white for harvest."
Ah, there you go.
So, that being said, let's go to John 7.
Indeed. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, John chapter 7 and 8. And by the way, one of the really, really excellent little short book that you can find. It's extremely easy reading, and it is called The Moses Connection. Uh, Help me remember the name of the author. Is it Daly? Let me see here.
It's a Bill Day,
Bill
actually.
Day. Bill Day. Yes. Uh, Bill Day.
Oh, you can read it for free if you have Kindle Unlimited.
There you go. Bill Day was a minister at a Church of Christ in Oklahoma City. When I very first heard about the manuscript, I heard about it from a guy who said, "I will make you a copy of it, but you have to promise on your life not to distribute it further than that." He said, "I gave my word to Brother Day I would not broadcast this because he says so many things in the book, and he's right." Uh, I got the impression, Daniel, and I've read the book 2 or 3 different times. It's got lots and lots of fantastic material in it. I got the impression that Brother Day is really a preterist, and he knew that some of the things that he was saying were so preterist that he thought he better put a little caveat in there and talk about the last day of time here and there and intersperse it, throughout the book to allay the fears of some people, of some heresy hunters, you
Right.
know, because I mean, it's that powerful. It's really that powerful. And again, it's easy reading, but he has done some marvelous research into the feast days of Israel. And his discussion of the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7 and John chapter 8 is one of the better brief. It's not super duper in depth, but nonetheless, it's one of the better brief descriptions of not only what they did during the Feast of Sukkot, but the significance of that. Now, I've just got to share this. In this book that I'm currently writing on the last day, last hour, last trumpet resurrection, the last trumpet is on the day of Sukkot. Okay. And on the very first day of the observance of Sukkot, they read what was known as the Haftorah. And the Haftorah included more than one text, but the key text that I find absolutely fascinating. Actually, there are two of them that I find absolutely fascinating. They would read Ezekiel 38 about Gog and Magog. Now, just think about that. What was it about the battle of Gog and Magog that the Jews linked to the observance of Sukkot? Kind of makes you go, huh. But the other passage that the Jews would read was Zechariah chapter 14. Now, Zechariah chapter 14 describes the time when Jerusalem would be taken, the city rifled, the women ravaged, in the day of the Lord. And at that day, in that day, which is the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, and by the way, this cannot be talking about the Babylonian destruction. At this time of this destruction of Jerusalem that is under view, living waters would flow out of the city of this Jerusalem. And in that day, all the nations of the earth would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And it would come to pass that the nations that would not go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles would be under the curse. So on the very first day of the Feast of Sukkot, they would read the Haftorah of Zechariah 14. And it just makes you wonder. Now, the reason they did that is because the Jews called the Feast of Tabernacle the joy of the nations. Because very clearly it teaches that the nations of the world, not just Israelites, not just Jews, but the nations of the world would worship the God of Israel. So again, that's why it was called Joy of the Nations. And so that's understandable from that level. But wait a minute. Just like the reading about Gog and Magog, you, ju- you just have to wonder, did the Jews never stop and wonder and ponder and contemplate that before the nations of the world would ever be able to worship the God of Israel, that Jerusalem had to first be destroyed and a new Jerusalem had to be created? I mean, this is this is absolutely incredible to me. Any thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, you do. You do wonder. You do wonder. But it seems like in the first century that that was the very thing that they were fighting so much against. I mean, with the stoning of Stephen and the accusations against him, and the witnesses against Jesus saying that he was saying that the temple was going to fall, and then of course with Paul in Acts 21 when they get so upset and they said he's teaching everywhere against this law and this people and this place, like like Jack Scott preached at Predators Pilgrim Weekend several years ago.
Yeah.
They were so against that idea, and yet it's right there in the prophets that the Gentiles would be included, and so it makes you wonder how, as you've said, how they missed that train coming. But
Yeah. And the interesting thing about it is, and let me see, I trying to remember which commentary it is. I think it's the Beacon Bible commentary. Um, some years ago, pointed out that Zechariah chapter 11 was understood by many of the ancient rabbis to be predictive of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Zechariah said, "Open your gates, O Lebanon, open your gates." And that was taken to mean that the gates of Jerusalem would be breached and she would be destroyed. And so, you know, um, and that one of the most famous of the Hebrew uh, rabbis of old, Yohanan ben Zakkai, and boy, fascinating character he is. As early as AD 30, okay, as early as AD 30, Yohanan ben Zakkai was predicting, and he was using Zechariah chapter 11, verse 1, to warn Israel Jerusalem was going to be destroyed in that generation. Now
wow,
that's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And matter of fact, in my book, uh, one of my books, I give that citation. I've forgotten now exactly which book it was. Uh, I believe the book was "We're Watching for the Parousia," where Jesus' apostles confused. Yes, that was indeed the book. I quote from rabbinic sources. I quote from patristic sources, which obviously are after the fact, but they're quoting Old Testament prophecies to justify the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And I quote from Josephus. In other words, what I did in that book is to point out that Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, although it was without any doubt troubling, it was without any doubt shocking. At the same time, it was not new news. I mean, when one of your most famous rabbis, Rabbi Ben Zakkai, is telling you this city is going to fall, and he's quoting from Zechariah to predict it,
Hmm.
yeah, they should have known. And well, ladies and gentlemen, we are completely out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us here this Tuesday evening on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Daniel, great to be with you. With that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.